It was a normal morning at the city courthouse. Chuck Norris, dressed in a crisp casual shirt and sunglasses, walked confidently toward the entrance, briefcase in hand. He had a case to review and a busy schedule ahead, but his mood was calm, almost serene. People passing by barely noticed him, just another man in the crowd. That calm, however, would not last. Out of nowhere, a uniformed police officer stepped in Chuck's path. His face was tense, eyes sharp, and his voice carried authority, and something else, suspicion. "Hey, stop right there," the officer barked. Chuck paused, tilting his head slightly, calm but alert. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. "You?" "Yes, you. I have a witness who says you stole a car from just down the street," the officer accused, pointing a finger directly at him. His tone was harsh, almost accusing Chuck of a serious crime in front of everyone nearby. Chuck's eyebrows lifted slightly, but his voice stayed steady. "I think there's been a mistake. I didn't take anything, officer. Perhaps you should check your facts." The officer's face tightened. "Don't play smart with me. How about you right here? Hands in the air now." People walking past stopped, sensing the tension. Phones were quickly pulled out. The scene felt charged, like an invisible wire stretched across the sidewalk, ready to snap. Chuck didn't raise his hands. He didn't need to. His calm, confident aura alone seemed to make the officer's aggressive stance feel oddly unsteady. "Sir, please, you're making a scene," Chuck said, his voice quiet but commanding. "I have nothing to hide, but you need to handle this properly." The officer scoffed, growing more impatient, glancing around at the gathering crowd, embarrassed that so many were watching. Chuck could feel the tension rising in the air. Not fear, but expectation. Everyone nearby was holding their breath, wondering, would this escalate? Would a simple accusation explode into chaos? What Chuck did next stunned everyone standing there, and no one could believe the officer's next move. The scene froze for a moment. The air felt heavy. Chuck's calm eyes scanned the officer, the crowd, and the courthouse entrance. Everyone could sense that this encounter would not end the way anyone expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave everyone shocked, and the officer completely unprepared for what was coming next. The officer didn't move an inch. His hand hovered near his radio, as if he was waiting for Chuck Norris to make the smallest mistake. The accusation still hung in the air, heavy, uncomfortable, and loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Chuck slowly exhaled. He could feel eyes on him now. Courthouse staff, pedestrians, even a few lawyers standing near the steps had stopped walking. Something about this situation felt wrong to them too. "Officer," Chuck said calmly, maintaining eye contact, "I believe you're mistaken. If there's been a report, I'm happy to cooperate, but accusations without verification help no one." The officer scoffed. "Oh, now you're telling me how to do my job?" His voice rose just enough to assert dominance. "You match the description. Dark clothing. Leaving the area. That's enough for me." Chuck tilted his head slightly. A description isn't proof. That response irritated the officer more than silence ever could have. He took a step closer, invading Chuck's personal space, trying to force a reaction. "Let me see your ID." Slowly, Chuck reached into his jacket pocket in a measured, deliberate motion. No sudden moves, no attitude. He handed over his identification and waited quietly. The officer looked down at the card, then frowned. His eyes scanned it again and again. Something didn't sit right, but instead of reassessing, the officer doubled down. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, handing it back abruptly. "People use fake IDs all the time." That's when the murmurs started. Why is he being treated like that? He's not even resisting. This feels unnecessary. A woman across the street had already pulled out her phone. Another man followed. Within seconds, at least 5 people were recording. Chuck noticed, but he didn't acknowledge the cameras. His focus stayed on the officer. "I'm willing to wait here," Chuck said evenly. "But if you're accusing me of crime, I'd like to know the evidence." The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not calmly, politely, and in public. "You're being detained," the officer snapped. "For further questioning." "For what specific charge?" Chuck asked. That question hit harder than expected. The officer hesitated, just for a split second, but the crowd noticed. That hesitation changed everything. The atmosphere shifted. This wasn't about a stolen car anymore. It was about power, control, ego. The officer cleared his throat. "Don't test me," he warned. "I can make this a lot harder for you." Chuck didn't raise his voice. He didn't step back. He didn't flinch. "Respectfully," he replied, "threats won't change the truth." The words landed like a quiet challenge. A man in the crowd whispered, "Who is this guy?" Another said, "He's way too calm." The officer glanced around again. Too many witnesses. Too many phones. He could feel the situation slipping. But instead of de-escalating, he pressed harder. "Turn around," the officer ordered. "Hands behind your back." The crowd gasped. Chuck paused, not out of fear, but out of principle. "Officer," he said firmly, "I haven't resisted. I haven't run. I've answered every question. There's no reason for this." For a moment, the street was silent. Then, "Quick question. Where are you watching this from right now? Which country or city? Drop it in the comments." Back in the scene, the officer felt the pressure. The audience. The cameras. The calm man who refused to break. His voice cracked just slightly as he spoke again. "Last warning." Chuck looked past him, toward the courthouse doors. Toward justice itself. "You're making a mistake," Chuck said quietly. "And once this goes further, you won't be able to undo it." That sentence landed differently. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The officer froze for half a second, then radioed in for backup. The sound of static filled the air, echoing the tension. The crowd grew larger. People sensed something big was unfolding, something that wouldn't end with handcuffs, but with consequences. Chuck stood perfectly still, composed, grounded, unshaken. And deep down, the officer felt it too. This man wasn't afraid, and that terrified him. The officer thought he was in control, but what happened next forced Chuck to make a decision that stunned everyone watching. The officer's radio crackled softly as he clipped it back onto his shoulder. Backup was on the way. That single fact changed the atmosphere completely. What had started as an accusation was now becoming a public standoff. Chuck Norris remained exactly where he was, feet planted, posture relaxed, hands visible. He wasn't trying to look brave. He simply was. And that calm only made the tension sharper. "You were warned," the officer said, his voice louder now, aimed as much at the crowd as at Chuck. "You don't get to decide how this goes." Chuck met his gaze. "I'm not deciding anything," he replied evenly. "I'm just standing here, cooperating." That answer irritated the officer more than open defiance ever could. He paced once, then stopped directly in front of Chuck again. "You think you're special?" the officer snapped. "You think rules don't apply to you?" Chuck shook his head slowly. "No, I think rules apply to everyone. That's the difference." The words landed hard. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. More people had gathered now, some watching from across the street, others standing closer, phones raised, recording every second. Someone whispered, "This is getting serious." The officer pointed toward the curb. "Step over there." "Now." Chuck paused, not because he was afraid, but because something deeper was happening. This wasn't about a stolen car anymore. This was about whether standing calmly for yourself was allowed or punished. "I haven't been told why I'm being detained," Chuck said firmly. "And I'm not resisting. I'm asking for clarity." The officer clenched his jaw. His face had flushed slightly. The crowd could see it now. He was losing control of the narrative. "You don't ask questions," he barked. "You follow orders." That sentence made the crowd shift uneasily. A man near the steps muttered, "That doesn't sound right." Another said, "He hasn't done anything." Chuck heard them, but he didn't look back. His attention stayed locked on the officer. "Authority without accountability," Chuck said calmly, "is how mistakes become tragedies." That stopped the officer cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The courthouse doors behind Chuck loomed large, symbols of law, justice, and order. The irony wasn't lost on the crowd. The officer took a breath, clearly trying to regain dominance. "Turn around," he repeated. "And behind your back." The tension spiked. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone else whispered, "Is he really arresting him?" Another voice said, "This is going too far." Chuck didn't move. Instead, he said something that no one expected. "Officer," he said quietly. I respect your uniform. But respect doesn't mean silence when something is wrong. Silence followed. You could hear traffic in the distance. A bird overhead. The soft hum of recording phones. The officer glanced around. Too many witnesses. Too many angles. Too many eyes. And then, almost without realizing it, he raised his voice again. You're obstructing. That's when the crowd reacted. No, he's not, someone shouted. He's being calm, another added. Let him speak. The officer spun toward the crowd. Back up, all of you. But it was too late. The dynamic had shifted. This was no longer one man versus authority. It was authority being questioned, calmly, publicly, and unmistakably. Be honest. If this were you, standing there while being threatened for something you didn't do, what would you do? Stay calm like Chuck, or speak up? Comment below. Chuck took one slow step forward. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to be heard. I'm not your enemy, he said. And neither is the law. But the way this is going, someone's going to regret it. That sentence landed differently than anything before it. The officer's radio crackled again. Unit en route, the dispatcher said. Backup was close now. The officer straightened his posture, trying to reclaim authority, but something was clearly off. His confidence was brittle. Forced. Chuck, on the other hand, looked exactly the same. Unshaken. Grounded. Certain. A man in the crowd whispered, Who is this guy? Another replied, I don't know, but he's not normal. The officer took a step back without realizing it. And in that tiny movement, barely noticeable, everything changed. Because for the first time since this began, the officer looked unsure. As the crowd whispered and doubt crept in, one bystander noticed something shocking, something that would flip this entire situation upside down. The officer didn't notice it at first, but the crowd did. Something had shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but unmistakably. The murmurs were no longer about the accusation. They were about Chuck. A middle-aged man, standing near the courthouse steps, squinted at Chuck's face. He leaned closer, tilting his head as if trying to line up a memory buried deep in his mind. No way, he whispered. The woman beside him glanced over. What? I swear I've seen him before, the man said. Not like famous, but important. The words spread quietly, like electricity through dry grass. Another bystander zoomed in with their phone, not to record the confrontation, but to get a better look at Chuck's face. His posture, his calm, the way he spoke with authority, but without ego. That's not how regular people act, someone murmured. He's way too composed, another added. Who stands like that when they're about to be arrested? Chuck remained unaware, or pretended to be. His attention stayed fixed on the officer, who was now struggling to maintain control over the situation. Step back, the officer ordered again, though his voice lacked the sharp edge it once had. You're creating a disturbance. Chuck responded calmly. I'm standing exactly where you told me to stand. That response drew a few quiet chuckles from the crowd. The officer glanced around, noticing the smiles, the whispers, the sideways looks. His jaw tightened. He didn't like losing command of the scene, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers. Enough, he snapped. You think you're smarter than everyone else here? Chuck didn't answer immediately. When he did, his tone was steady. I think calm thinking matters, especially in public. That sentence struck a nerve. The officer looked toward the incoming backup route, then back at Chuck. Something in his expression flickered. Doubt, maybe even unease. Behind him, a young woman whispered urgently to her friend, Wait, look at his ID photo from earlier. Did you see his name? No, what? I didn't catch it, but the officer looked confused when he read it. Another man nearby said quietly, You don't argue like that unless you know the law. The whispers grew louder. Is he a lawyer? No, maybe a politician? Or military? Whatever he is, he's not just some random guy. The officer finally noticed a change in tone around him. What's going on? He barked at the crowd. This doesn't concern you. But his words no longer carried the same weight. A man near the curb spoke up, cautiously but clearly. Officer, with respect, this gentleman hasn't done anything wrong. The officer turned sharply. Sir, step back. I'm just saying, the man continued. This doesn't look right. The officer's face flushed again. He was being questioned, openly now. Chuck spoke before things could spiral. "Let's keep this professional," he said. "No one here wants a scene." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Chuck was the calmest person there, yet he was the one being treated like a criminal. That's when someone else finally connected the dots. A woman who had been silent until now gasped softly. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her friend leaned in. "What? I know who he is." Several heads turned. "Who?" She hesitated, unsure. Then she said it, quietly, but loud enough for those closest to hear. "That's Chuck Norris." A ripple ran through the crowd. "No, it's not. It can't be. Wait. Look at him again." Phones zoomed in. People stared harder now. The calm. The confidence. The unmistakable presence. "But why would Chuck Norris be here?" someone asked. Another voice answered, low and serious. "Because he works here." The officer didn't hear the words yet, but he saw the change in faces. Confusion had turned into recognition. Curiosity into realization. "What?" the officer snapped. "What's everyone looking at?" Chuck stayed silent. He didn't confirm. He didn't deny. He didn't use his identity as a shield. That restraint only made the moment heavier. The woman who recognized him whispered again, this time more confidently. "I saw him on the news months ago. A ceremony. A judicial appointment. That stopped a few people cold. A judge. No way. State level. Supreme Court?" The officer's ears caught that last word. He turned slowly. "What did you say?" No one answered immediately. The silence felt deliberate. Then Chuck finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty. "Officer," he said, "this situation doesn't need to escalate any further." The officer looked at him closely now. Really looked, not as a suspect, but as a man who knew exactly how this would end. And for the first time since the accusation began, the officer felt something unfamiliar. Fear. In the next moment, Chuck would say just one sentence, 6 words, that completely froze the officer in place. The air felt tight, not tense like before, but heavy, as if the moment itself was holding its breath. The officer stood a few feet from Chuck Norris now, staring at him in a way that was no longer aggressive, but uncertain. His confidence had cracked, and everyone could see it. "You said this didn't need to escalate," the officer said slowly. "Why?" Chuck looked him straight in the eye. His voice was calm, level, controlled, because he already knew the answer would do more damage than any argument ever could. "Because," Chuck said quietly, "I'm a state Supreme Court judge." 6 words. That was all it took. The officer froze. Not metaphorically. Physically. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hand, which had been hovering near his radio, dropped to his side. The color drained from his face so fast, it was almost unsettling. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps. Sharp inhales. Someone whispered, "Oh no." Another said, "He didn't know." Phones shook in people's hands. A judge. A Supreme Court judge? He accused him? The officer blinked twice, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. That's not funny," he said weakly. "If this is some kind of joke." Chuck didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. He didn't move. "It's not a joke," he said. "And this is exactly why I stayed calm." Silence. Pure, absolute silence. The officer swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to Chuck's face again, this time seeing everything he'd missed before. The posture, the precision in his words, the certainty, the restraint. This man hadn't been calm because he was powerless. He'd been calm because he was in control. The officer's voice dropped. "Sir, Chuck gently raised a hand. "Don't," he said. "This isn't about me." That sentence confused everyone. The crowd leaned in. "This," Chuck continued, "is about what happens when assumptions replace facts. When authority forgets accountability." Each word landed like a verdict. The officer nodded repeatedly now, panic setting in. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I swear I had no idea." "I know," Chuck replied. "And that's the problem." The words hit harder than anger ever could. The officer stepped back half a pace. His shoulders slumped. The power dynamic had completely flipped, but Chuck hadn't raised his voice once. Backup sirens could be heard in the distance now. but they sounded irrelevant. The crowd had already decided who held the authority here. A man in the back muttered, "He handled that like a judge." Another replied, "Because he is one." The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, Judge Norris, I apologize for the misunderstanding." Chuck nodded once. "Apologies matter," he said, "but reflection matters more." The officer lowered his head. "I let this go too far." "Yes," Chuck said simply. "You did. That admission hurt, but it was clean, honest, necessary." Chuck turned slightly, addressing not just the officer, but the crowd. "Most people don't get the chance to say who they are before they're judged," he said. "Today you saw what that looks like. No shouting, no humiliation, just truth." The officer looked up again, his voice quiet now. "What happens next?" Chuck met his gaze. "That depends," he said, "on what you choose to learn from this moment." Another silence followed, this one heavier than the first. The officer straightened his posture, suddenly very aware of the cameras, the witnesses, and the weight of what had just happened. "I'll file a report," he said, "exactly as it occurred." Chuck nodded. "Good." The backup car pulled up and stopped. But by then it didn't matter. The real judgment had already been delivered. What happened next, when the backup officers stepped out of their car, turned this moment from shocking into unforgettable. The backup patrol car rolled to a slow stop at the curb. Its presence alone drew everyone's attention. Two officers stepped out, calm, professional, unaware that the situation they were walking into had already changed forever. One of them glanced to the crowd first. Phones raised, faces tense, silence heavy. Then he looked at Chuck and stopped. His expression shifted instantly. Not confusion, not suspicion, but recognition. "Judge Norris?" he said almost instinctively. The words echoed. The first officer, the one who had made the accusation, felt his stomach drop. "Yes," Chuck replied calmly. "Good afternoon." The second officer straightened immediately. "Sir, we were informed there was a situation." "There was," Chuck said. "It's under control now." That sentence landed harder than any lecture. The backup officers didn't need explanations. They could read the scene, the body language, the crowd, the way the first officer stood slightly back now, no longer in command. The second officer turned to his colleague. "What happened?" The accused officer swallowed. "I made an assumption," he admitted. "I handled it poorly." That admission, spoken out loud, in front of witnesses, changed everything. The crowd reacted with quiet shock. He admitted it. At least he owned it. That takes guts. Chuck didn't interrupt. He let the officer speak. "I accused him without confirming facts," the officer continued. "I escalated when I shouldn't have." The second officer nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest." Then he turned to Chuck. "Sir, are you okay?" Chuck nodded once. "I am. No complaints. No demands. No threats. Just facts." The backup officer took a breath. "We'll document everything," he said. "By the book." Chuck looked at him. "That's all anyone can ask." The officer who had made the accusation looked up, visibly shaken. "Judge, I'm sorry." Chuck studied him for a moment. This wasn't the kind of apology people make when they're scared of consequences. This one came from realization. "I believe you," Chuck said. "But remember this, most people don't get the benefit of being recognized." The officer nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Chuck turned toward the crowd. People leaned in. They expected anger, a speech, maybe even humiliation. Instead, they got something else. "Today," Chuck said, "you didn't just witness a misunderstanding. You witnessed how quickly power can slip when it isn't questioned, and how calmly it can be corrected." The crowd stayed silent, listening. "Respect," Chuck continued, "isn't about rank. It's about restraint." Those words settled deep. "Let me ask you, how would you react if someone with authority treated you unfairly? Stay calm like Chuck, or speak up immediately? Comment below." The officer lowered his head again. "I'll accept whatever review comes from this." Chuck nodded. "Accountability isn't punishment," he said. "It's correction." The backup officers exchanged a glance. One of them spoke quietly. "We'll handle the report." The first officer took a step back, no longer at the center of the scene. The power had fully shifted, but not through force. Through clarity. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with admiration. He didn't embarrass him. He taught him. That's real authority. Chuck picked up his briefcase. Before leaving, he turned back once more. "Officer," he said, meeting the man's eyes. "What matters most isn't that you made a mistake. It's what you do the next time." The officer nodded. "There will be a next time," he said, "and I'll do better." Chuck gave a single, respectful nod and walked toward the courthouse doors. No applause, no celebration, just quiet respect. Behind him, the crowd slowly dispersed, already uploading videos, already replaying the moment in their minds. They hadn't witnessed a confrontation. They had witnessed a lesson. Within hours, this moment would explode across the internet. And what happened next shocked even Chuck himself. By the time Chuck Norris reached his office, the story had already escaped the courthouse walls. Someone uploaded the video. Then another. Then another. Within hours, clips of the encounter flooded social media, each one capturing a different angle of the same moment. A calm man accused, an authority challenged without aggression, and a truth revealed with restraint. The internet reacted fast. This is how power should be handled. He didn't raise his voice once. That officer learned a lesson he'll never forget. News outlets picked it up next. Headlines focused not on the accusation, but on Chuck's composure. State Supreme Court judge demonstrates calm authority during public encounter. Comment sections exploded. People shared their own stories, times they had been accused, profiled, misunderstood, or silenced. For many, watching Chuck stand his ground without anger felt personal. He spoke for people who never get the chance, one comment read. This wasn't about fame. It was about dignity, said another. By evening, the police department released a brief statement. It didn't assign blame publicly. It didn't escalate drama. It acknowledged the incident, confirmed an internal review, and emphasized training and accountability. That response mattered. But what mattered more was Chuck's reaction. When reporters reached out for comment, they expected a strong statement. Maybe criticism. Maybe a demand for consequences. They didn't get that. Chuck's response was short. "I don't want punishment. I want reflection." Authority works best when it listens. That single sentence spread just as fast as the video. People noticed something important. Chuck never once mentioned his title as a shield. He never used his position to embarrass anyone. He never acted superior. He acted responsible. Meanwhile, the officer involved stayed off social media. According to sources, he requested additional training and asked to be temporarily reassigned. Not because he was forced, but because he said he needed time to think. That detail changed public opinion. He owned it. That's how growth starts. A few days later, Chuck spoke privately to a group of law students. He didn't mention the incident by name, but everyone knew what he meant. "Justice isn't loud," he said. "It's precise." Those words echoed far beyond the room. The video eventually slowed, but the impact didn't. People kept sharing it. Teachers used it in classrooms. Community leaders referenced it in meetings. Parents showed it to their kids, not as entertainment, as an example. And that's why this moment mattered. Not because someone famous was involved, but because it showed what happens when calm meets chaos and refuses to become it. If you believe calm intelligence is stronger than aggression, type respect in the comments. And subscribe for more stories that challenge power and honor dignity. The screen faded, but the lesson stayed.